Good morning and welcome to the Sunday Supplement. It's been yet another week without football, of course, but it hasn't stopped intense coverage of the sport that we love. And of course, it focuses on one thing, one theme, but in several different guises. When will it return? How will it return? And where it might actually be played, and if, indeed at all, it will return. So, to discuss that and many other issues, we have a panel this morning, namely Oliver Holt, the chief sports writer of the Mail on Sunday. We're also joined by Darren Lewis, football writer from the Mirror, and the chief sports correspondent of the Times, Matt Lawton. Gentlemen, good morning and welcome all. I think first of all we have to say welcome from home, Ollie and Matt. Darren, you appear to have your own professional studio somewhere. So I'm very, very impressed indeed. You obviously do a lot of this sort of thing. Right, let's have a quick look at today's headlines and get a flavour of today's newspapers. Starting with Sam Wallace in The Telegraph. Yeah, interesting piece from Sam on the back of the Friday Premier League call. He says there's a major rift between the top 14 Premier League clubs and those in the bottom 6, with concerns that the strugglers will try to block the completion of the season. Now, there's a very, very fetching photograph of our friend and colleague Gary Neville, g'day, mate, in the Sun. But on a serious point, Gary proposed a few days ago, why not finish the season abroad? Why not take it somewhere where it's safe? Well, he has a champion in Gary Williams, an agent out in Perth, Australia, who says, look, this is no different to going on a world tour. We are out of lockdown here. People are gathering. Perth is the most isolated city in the world, and they have had a comparatively low number of coronavirus deaths in Australia, less than 100. Joe Bernstein, in Ollie's paper, in the Mail on Sunday, he has picked up on an interview that Kevin De Bruyne gave to a Belgian newspaper, fairly wide-ranging interview. And he says, with regard to the club's potential suspension from the Champions League, look, 2 years without Champions League would be long. 1 year is something I might be able to cope with. So that will obviously raise a few eyebrows. And in his weekly column for The Times, which is very illuminating on a weekly basis, Wayne Rooney has written about the importance of hard work alongside natural talent. And it clearly isn't enough just to have natural talent. And he picks the example of Ravel Morrison, a player widely regarded as an enigma, had all the talent in the world. And he says quite simply that Ravel Morrison was miles better than Paul Pogba and Jesse Lingard, but he just didn't work like Gary Neville. So, as I said, an awful lot to discuss, and I think I'd like to start with you, Matt. What did Friday's meeting at the Premier League, although obviously it was a dial-in meeting, what did that change, and what do you think was the chief outcome from it?
Well, the key thing that it reinforced, Geoff, was the sort of inevitable conclusion that the Premier League, if it is concluded this season, will have to be played at neutral venues. On April the 17th, at the previous shareholders' meeting, the clubs were told it was a distinct possibility. They were warned that it might not be possible to finish the season in their own grounds. And then in the week, we saw Mark Roberts, the most senior football police officer in the country, saying it was going to be too much of a challenge for policing on safety grounds to use all 20 home grounds. So what they were told in the meeting, Geoff, was that it would be between 8 and 10 neutral venues. And obviously that presents problems, and Sam Wallace's piece is quite right. The clubs at the very bottom are very nervous about that. We've seen twice this week Paul Barber at Brighton, the chief executive, express concerns about that, and with good reason, because if you look at Brighton's final fixtures, Geoff, they've got 4 of their last 5 home games are against Liverpool, Arsenal, Manchester United and Manchester City. And, you know, you're already playing in an environment with no fans. But if you give away that small advantage of playing on your own pitch, and all pitches are different, all the dimensions are different, and the home comforts of your own dressing room, you give that away as well, and then you get relegated, you can see why clubs would be very unhappy about that. It's a huge departure from the competition they signed up for in August, and that is what the clubs, particularly at the bottom, particularly those who are in danger of losing their Premier League status and all the riches and profile that comes with that, because it's not just the TV money, it's sponsorship, everything is impacted by being in the Premier League. So you can see why they're very nervous to agree to this kind of competition, the conclusion of this competition, when they might actually be relegated in those circumstances.
But Ollie, can you see that something has to give, and there is an impasse? And Matt has outlined those very real and absolutely fair concerns from those struggling clubs. But can you put the case for why it has to be the same for everybody, and people just have to accept? And that's easy for me to say. I'm not involved in one of those clubs, but have to accept these are extenuating circumstances, and as part of the main goal, which is to complete the season, that if neutral venues are the only way to do so, then they have to accept that.
I think that's probably the case, Geoff. But I think it is problematic, and I mean I'm a believer in the fact that if we can't complete the season, if the season has to be curtailed, then it should be decided on a points per game basis. Now, one of the main objections to that system is that it would not take into account, say, who has home games left, who has away games, who's played who at home, etc. Now, this system of playing at neutral venues effectively, has the same effect. It will still skew the integrity of the competition. So I do understand the objections from people like Paul Barber, and I think Brighton are one of the clubs who have gone public yesterday, I think, about or on Friday, about their objections to this particular plan. So I can see that. Look, I think it's an incredibly difficult situation, and you referenced Sam Wallace's piece. I think Sam has also written today about the desirability, obviously, that we, in an ideal world, we would all love the season to be finished. But this is not an ideal world that we're living in at the moment. And I just think that the discussions that we are having in the Premier League are looking increasingly desperate and out of step.
Darren, do you think that the season has to be finished, or when you take into account what Ollie's saying there, we are, as Ollie said, getting towards desperate states, and it may not just be possible?
Well, I think you obviously had a chat about this last week with the guys, Geoff, and since then it's all moved on because the players have now come out and voiced their opposition to it. There has been a considerable shift in the appetite amongst fans as well. Each new suggestion seems a little bit more desperate than the last one. And I'm very much a believer that if we're talking about retaining the sporting integrity, then how can you bend the competition out of shape? How can you play a competition for 2/3 of the season where clubs are able to enjoy home advantage and then suddenly play the final third of the competition in other parts of the country? Or I agree with so much of what Gary Neville's got to say, but that's the one thing I just can't go along with, because if you're going to change the conditions where people play, the suggestion that you could have maybe 5 substitutes instead of 3, if you're moving all the conditions around in order to complete the season, you've got a different competition. You're not having the one that you started out playing for 2/3 of the season. So you can see why clubs at the bottom end of the Premier League are concerned about it and are voicing their opinions, because now is the time to do that. And I think, we haven't got to the players as yet, but I think the player view is key. Steve Parish, a terrific column this morning. I don't agree with all of what he said, but he sets it out so well, because this is a conundrum to which there is no easy answer. But at the centre of it is the concern of the players. Aguero saying he's scared. Glenn Murray speaking over the last couple of days saying, look, how can you take ambulances away from the NHS where they are most required? Cresswell, Ogbonna, Guendouzi, Wayne Rooney are right at the start of this speaking as well. And that's before you get to the problem surrounding the BAME community with the high number of COVID-19 death rates among them. There are so many issues relating to this, Geoff, that we need to consider. And home advantage is just one of them.
The other question as well, though, Matt, wasn't all sporting integrity lost when the season stopped? Because it stopped for so long. We're not talking about a weekend's fixtures being cancelled. We're over a month now. So has that, if you like, the tenet of that argument, has that not gone away? Because there have been players injured at that time who'll be fit again now. It's a whole different scenario. It's not the same competition.
Yeah, but there's at least some integrity maintained if you do at least play the games home and away, the 92 remaining games. But I think Darren raises a really important point, Geoff. Players are concerned, and I think, as Bruyne said this morning, it's not necessarily about themselves, because most of them should be. They are fit young men. They shouldn't be in a risk category. Although there was a very interesting piece that we referenced in the Times a couple of weeks ago that was from the Lancet, which was talking about endurance athletes, and because they and elite athletes, because they actually put their respiratory systems through quite a lot of stress because of the nature of what they do, they could actually be more susceptible to COVID-19 than other people of their sort of age bracket. But the thing is, what I can't quite get my head round is, Steve Parish in the column today in the Sunday Times, he talked about it being safer to be in a football match than to go to the local supermarket. And he's probably right about that, but you can't guarantee the safety of players at the moment, because even with these 40,000 tests, the fact is the tests don't necessarily work. Like, we know that. You get lots of false negatives. As I understand it, you only get a positive test if somebody is symptomatic. Therefore, the idea that you can create this kind of biosphere at a stadium and everyone be in there be safe, I just don't see how you can guarantee it. So the big thing for me, and Ollie wrote a very good column today in the Mail on Sunday, and he made the point that football isn't separate to society. Football is part of society. And if I was a Premier League footballer, if everyone else is being told to maintain this social distancing, and when we go to the supermarket, as Steve Parish talks about it, if we're all being made to queue outside and be 6 feet apart, the idea that you're going to tell 400 young guys, right, you guys are the exception, it's all right if you run around on a football pitch for 90 minutes and bump into each other and mark each other at corners, you can see why they're going to object to this.
That's a minefield. That's a minefield in itself, because as soon as you talk about going back, the players, they'll be allowed to go and have a haircut, and as soon as they go to a haircut, they're at risk as well. So, yeah. I mean, I think, Ollie, the beauty of Steve Parish's column this morning was it was a balanced look. He said, look, we recognise where we stand. I think he said, football is meaningless, but it is magnificently meaningless. And he makes no apology for saying, yes, we understand those things. Of course, we wouldn't take away equipment from the healthcare workers and the police. I understand all that. But at the same time, it is a business. And starting for next August, they potentially have got no income whatsoever. There's a very, very real chance football could disappear. So I think what was good about it, Ollie, was it was contextual. Of course, he understands its importance in terms of its place in society, but at the same time, football is a very, very real financial problem right now.
That's all true, Geoff, and I thought, in common with the others, I felt that Steve Parish's piece was very good, and as Gary Neville has pointed out this morning, at least he put his head above the parapet, and it was good that he talked about it. However, I agree entirely with both Darren and Matt, and I think that more and more this week we are going to start seeing the issues, the agenda moving towards the players and their concerns. I know that, and I'm sure the other guys do too. I know that several managers who are going to be speaking to their players about safety issues this week, they're aware of concerns that the players have. And again, I thought Steve Parish's piece was excellent, but ultimately he can't address the concerns that players have. He can say that it's safer going to the match than going to a supermarket, but how can you say that players playing a match where, as Matt said, where they're grappling with each other at corners, they're falling over each other, they're breathing heavily, they're next to each other. You can't. I'm sorry, but you can't protect players at the moment. And I think players, as Matt mentioned, players don't exist in a vacuum. And why the problem that football has, I think, Geoff, the big problem is that football is judged by higher standards. So it has more scrutiny on it than somebody going to a supermarket. If a football player, and let's face it, in the Premier League, we have a high proportion of superstar players. If a football player gets sick, and he gets very sick because he's caught the coronavirus playing football, playing in one of these matches in this cordon sanitaire that we're erecting around players, if he gets sick, really sick, football is going to have a massive problem. And it's okay talking about, I understand that we're desperate to come back. We're all desperate. We all work, however loosely, in football. We're desperate to come back. But if something like that happens, it will set football back a lot further than the situation that we're in now.
Those are all very, very valid points, Ollie. I think Steve Parish said it was training was safe. I'm not sure it actually matches. But anyway, we've got to take a break right now. But afterwards, we're discussing Gary Neville's proposal for the games to be taken abroad. Welcome back to the Sunday Supplement. There have been a number of suggestions about how the season could be or potentially be completed. And one of them has come from Gary Neville, who mooted the idea last week that perhaps they could be abroad. Well, this has now had some support from Perth, Australia. I think that's not a photo, the genuine photo, in fairness to Gary, with a gentleman, a resident of Perth, Gary Williams, an agent, saying, why not? Why not play it here? 9,000 miles away. They have much less stringent rules at the moment. Been very, very few deaths, less than 100 deaths from coronavirus. It's just like clubs going on a world tour. We've got the venues. So, Darren, do you think this... I mean, it doesn't appear to have garnered popular support here, or do you think it's a non-starter?
I think it's a non-starter, Geoff. As I was saying earlier, Gary is in many ways led the conversation on the realities of this situation, calling things as they are and speaking in a way that footballers have really resonated with. I know Simon Francis from Bournemouth spoke in the Times about the many things that Gary has been saying that reflect the views of footballers across the country. But on this, I just can't see it being a starter because, as I said before, if you're going to have a competition, everything about that competition has to remain the same if you are going to restart. If you're going to change the rules, if you're going to change the venues, it simply doesn't work. There's this talk about Wembley being used and White Hart Lane and London, and St George's Park. Well, as we know, London's had 18,000 coronavirus cases. The East Midlands, the Midlands as a whole has had 11,000 coronavirus cases. This country, and I could see why Gary's come up with the idea, because there have been so many cases of the virus in this country and so many deaths. But to take the game abroad, I mean, we're not talking about a pre-season friendly here. We're talking about completing the season. And if you change the rules and then clubs were to fail, were to get relegated on the basis of playing the final 8, 9, 10 games of this season on those rules as opposed to the rules and the parameters of the first 2/3 of the season, they'd have reason to be upset. I think you have to keep it as it is. And I think Ollie suggested a couple of times, if you are going to complete it, wait. And complete it if it's September, if it's October, whatever. Wait until you can complete it then. But to take it abroad, not for me.
Well, the other thing, Matt, is as well, don't forget when they were talking about having the Formula One Grand Prix in Australia, it was cancelled as soon as one mechanic became infected. So even if you plan to do it, it's not fraught. It's not without being fraught with danger of being called off at the last moment too. I suppose the only other potential thing, but it's probably not the reason to do it, is that you wouldn't have crowds in this country flocking to a ground. But in its own way, that would make it even worse for fans, wouldn't it? That they can't go to the games, but fans in another country could.
Well, even if that was allowed, I think the biggest stumbling block with it, Geoff, would be if you were Australian and you've got so few cases, why you'd want 2,000 people arriving from the worst hit country in Europe. So I just think it's completely implausible. It's a couple of plane loads of potentially infected people. Yeah, bring them over. Let's let them play some football. Oh, journalists. Oh, staff from the clubs. Where are they all going to stay? It's completely. I'm sorry. Yeah, I agree with Darren. I think Gary's been excellent on this debate, but I don't think this one is a goer at all. I think I think one of the other things that we haven't touched on yet that I think has to be the fairest way to do it is actually to take relegation out of this from the Premier League because it is such a departure if they're going to play the rest of the season. I just don't see how you can relegate anybody without there being massive challenges if they've lost all the advantages that you might have in the final few games of the season.
Ollie, would you be in favour of that? And also, would you expect an expand, but still have promotion? Would you expect an expanded Premier League for next season?
Yeah, I can. First of all, apologies to Gary for completing the grand slam about his idea of competing abroad, because I don't think that's a goer, and I think that the optics, as people say, of that wouldn't look good. I agree with Matt, of us exporting our issues to another country. I don't think would be a very good look. As far as relegation, I mean, as I said, I'm a proponent of the points per game system of finishing the season. Increasingly, I think, I would love the season to be completed. Increasingly, I feel concerned that is not going to happen anytime soon. So, I mean, if it's possible to complete it in September or October, if it takes that long, then that's fine. As far I understand the issue about relegation and people saying we can decide promotion issues more easily and European places, they're not quite as contentious. My own opinion, and people will say it's harsh, is that if we go with a points per game situation, we should go with it across the board, and we should use that to decide relegation too. And I know that that's harsh. There is no fair system. We're living with a crisis the like of which no one in our lifetimes has experienced before, and there is no good solution. People say that there will be legal action, and there may well be, and that has already partly been suggested in France, I think, after they decided to end their season on a points per game basis. But if there is legal action from clubs, if this scenario does map out, then equally I don't think legal action is going to be a very good look in the middle of a pandemic. So, as I say, unfortunately, there's no good solution.
Matt, what are you expecting from the Premier League this week? As we understand it, they're waiting to hear what the government say on Thursday with regards to easing lockdown. That's a date which the whole country obviously already has in their minds, and it's likely the Premier League will take their cue from that. But what are you expecting, given the hints that have been about easing lockdown, and also going back to Sam's piece, with Sam Wallace's piece in the Telegraph, with regards to the potential conflict or disagreement from 6 of the clubs? What would happen if they said, OK, we're going to finish the season, end it now, and whether it be no relegation, whether it be points per game, whatever the system is, what happens? What's your understanding if there are 6 clubs in disagreement?
I think there's potentially more than 6, Geoff. On Friday, I was hearing as many as 10 are against the neutral venues proposal. The difficult bit to read at the moment is whether it's part of a huge game of poker, and whether they are simply will be prepared to resume the season and play at neutral venues if you take this relegation threat off the table. Because I agree with Ollie, but I just think part of the problem with English football, and it's a problem that a lot of the clubs in the Championship voice, is this massive gulf between the Premier League and the Championship. And it's why Championship clubs get into trouble financially, because they gamble on they spend massively to try and get to the Premier League, because it's hundreds of millions of pounds that you're talking about. We always talk about the Championship playoff final being the £200 million football match or whatever. So the idea that see, Ollie's right, it would be a bad look, but my word, if after all of this, if what the pandemic means is that I'm being dumped out of the Premier League after 29 games, when no one saw that coming, I think there will be legal challenges. So look, I think it's going to be a very bumpy week for the Premier League. I think there's obviously talk of a meeting on Friday. We thought it was Thursday. Richard Masters suggested in a letter at the start of the week that it would be Thursday. Start of this week that it would be next Thursday. But bearing in mind that the government press conferences tend to happen at 5 o'clock, so I imagine they'll meet on Friday when they're going to discuss all these issues. And the clubs have got to agree to this. The clubs have got to agree that if they're given the green light by the government to start going back to training, then they've got to agree that with this neutral venues proposal. And at the moment, I don't see them agreeing unless certain stipulations are made.
I totally understand Matt's point about relegation, and in many ways, I agree with it too. I accept that it would be. I accept that it would be harsh and to go on points per game, and that the repercussions for those 3 clubs who are currently in those in those relegation positions are enormous financially. So, look, I can see both sides. Equally, I think there's a situation that, okay, so if the problem is if we don't go for relegation, we then what do we do? Because it would be incredibly unfair not to promote, as things stand, Leeds and West Brom. So then we have a bigger division, a bigger Premier League next year. Obviously, I've seen that proposal put forward. That then creates more challenges. So we have a mess, and in some ways that I just think the simplest thing, we have played 3/4 of our season. It's not massively fair that we end it now, but as I've said before, the unfortunate thing is there is no good solution.
I'd agree with that. I mean, the word you used that resonated most there, Ollie, is a mess. Because if you, for example, look at Chelsea, and I've raised this point a couple of times in the Daily Mirror, Chelsea have a couple of players out of contract after July. If the competition goes beyond July, they could be without those players. Frank Lampard raises this in The Sun on Sunday today. And if you go beyond July and you've got so many players who are not available to play for their clubs, players who have been registered for their clubs at the end of at the end of January, then suddenly you've got a situation again where you have a different competition to the one that we started with. And I think because all of this points per game is so fraught with difficulty, because of the reasons that you both have suggested, I think the best thing to do is you could wait, but then if you wait, you just end up in a bit of a minefield. It's a hard one. I think that the best thing to do is curtail.
How long would you wait, Darren? How long would you give it? How long would you wait for?
Well, as I said before, I'm almost contradicting myself in a way, because I've talked about waiting, but then I've talked about the difficulties of players being out of contract when you get to July. And so that then takes you back to curtailing, even though that does leave you in a mess as well, Geoff.
Okay, well, I can guarantee, though, we will finish this show. So don't go away, but we're going to take a break right now. But join us for Sunday Supplement after this. This is the Sunday Supplement. Of course, we're talking about principally when and how football will return. Matt Lawton, I want to put to you that we discussed earlier in the show that the Premier League will take their cue from government when they make their announcement on Thursday with regard to the easing of lockdown. But how much should football take their cue from government? Because don't forget, football volunteered, if you like. They chose, once Mikel Arteta became infected, they postponed all the games at the weekend. That wasn't under government advice. So how closely allied are they to government's advice?
No, I think entirely now, Geoff. I think firstly, from a perception point of view, they have to be seen to be respecting government guidance, government regulations on lockdown. But actually now, because it is basically the law of the land now, that they have to be given the green light by government. So they're entirely in the hands of the government. This cross sports working group was formed. It's being led by the ECB, but it's the as somebody from one of the Olympic sports said, it's the big four. It's football, cricket, rugby, and horse racing. And officials from those four sports have formed this group with medical experts from each sport. It's the chief medical officer of the ECB who's sort of leading that with the chief executive of the ECB. And there are, there were talks earlier this week with government. So they have to take government guidance. They can't go back to training. And training is supposed to be in 3 different phases even. It's groups without contact, or small groups without contact, small groups with contact, and then full contact training. And they will only take those steps when the government says it's okay to do so.
The fascinating thing about that, Matt, is that you look at the government advice. Well, they suggested it was okay for sport to continue in the week of the Cheltenham Festival, and we've seen a spike in cases in the areas around the racecourse, and they suggested it was okay for Atletico fans to fly in from Spain, where they'd had a high number of coronavirus cases, and we've seen a spike in that area of Liverpool as well. And I think a lot of people are looking at the way the decision-making of the government, and they're concerned about it. It does look very much as though, and you don't have to wear any kind of politics to be of the opinion that the government are looking to restart the economy, and you can understand totally why they are trying to do that. But it just all looks too soon. You look at parents, the idea, and I know they've published some guidelines today suggesting how we can get out of lockdown, and the idea that kids could be going back to school in June. A lot of parents are concerned about that. Some may well take the decision not to send their kids to school. There will be people who are comfortable with it, and we have to recognise that and look at both sides of this argument. But in terms of the decision-making of the government, 1 week you've got the chief medical officer saying one thing, another week you've got Matt Hancock, the health secretary, saying another. The government can't decide whether it's following the science or not. And so, yes, it's entirely right that football should be taking government advice, and you can understand, as you've just outlined, the reasons why. But you can understand too why people are saying, well, hang on a minute, is the government... Boris Johnson has said today, I was in denial about the scale of my symptoms and I had to be forced to go to the hospital. That's almost a microcosm of the problem around the government. A lot of people feel they waited too late to lock down. You've got a situation, for example, in France where they have fewer cases than we have in this country, fewer deaths, and yet they've taken the decision not to have any sport until September. And yet you've got Ollie Dowden in this country saying, yes, let's get sport going again. Let's get football going again. There are so many mixed messages around government advice that you can understand why people are concerned.
Yeah, I totally agree with Darren. I totally agree with Darren about the mixed messages. And I know that Darren shares this particular concern, and I make no apology actually for coming back to it, but I don't see how at the moment we can protect the players. We have the chief medical officer telling us that there will be social distancing or some form of social distancing for the rest of the year, and yet we're talking about thrusting players back into what, despite some cynics might say, is still a contact sport. I just don't get how we can guarantee the safety of players. And sometimes we seem to put players at the bottom of the list here, and because they're well paid and they live very comfortable lives. But as we've already said before, they don't exist in a vacuum. They have the same concerns as the rest of us. And at the moment, I just don't see how we can guarantee their safety in a way that we are trying to protect the safety of the normal population with various, let's say, social distancing measures. That Darren hit the nail on the head. There are mixed messages here, and until we sort those mixed messages out and gain some clarity, it all feels too early.
I think that's right, Ollie, and I actually think that football has been used as a bit of a political football throughout this whole lockdown. I think the government are using the Premier League to some degree to take the temperature of the situation, because you can see that the steps that they're looking to perhaps take to return to some form of normality are being done in tandem with a possible return of the Premier League. At the same time, it was, Darren's point about mixed messages, that we were being told by the chief medical officer's office that actually the real threat wasn't mass gatherings, which was why we had that Liverpool game against Atletico Madrid, why we had Cheltenham, and then suddenly, oh no, hang on a minute, loads of people have been infected by going to Cheltenham. So look, you have to accept that everyone is learning as they're going along with this thing. These are unprecedented times, and the government haven't always got it right. But it just feels too soon. I think one of the other things we haven't touched on is the infection rate, and Germany is looking to bring football back, but their infection rate is below 1. We are still much higher than that, and I just think it's, until that situation is addressed, until that changes dramatically, until it really looks like, it's all very well Boris Johnson saying that we're past the peak, but until we're a long way beyond the peak, I just don't see how we can expect 400 guys to just ignore all social distancing rules to put on a show for all of us.
Well, the truth is, Matt, that you can't guarantee the safety of everybody. Nobody can. And we all in our own personal lives will be making decisions about what we do, what we don't do as lockdown eases. You mentioned Germany there as well. They've gone back to training. Three Cologne players have already tested positive for the coronavirus. But, Ollie, I want to ask you, there's a number of reports this morning that a few clubs are actually talking about or contemplating the scenario where the whole of next season is wiped out as well. Because what's going to change? What's going to be different about next season if this continues? You get to the point where this season, you have to terminate it in whatever fashion. It is a real possibility when you talk about all those, quite rightly, those precautions and all of those safety factors. It might not come back at all. We might be looking. We're trying to save the tail end of this season. That could soon shift to trying to save the whole of next season, which is, as you know, a completely different scale in terms of the structure of football.
It is, Geoff, and I think it's an entirely legitimate concern. I mean, I think Matt just referred to infection rates then, and I think in terms of the way we look at this, I think once our numbers, the numbers of deaths and the number of infections start to come down considerably, then that's when there'll be more public appetite for a resumption. I think at the moment, I still think the vast majority of people are uneasy. Of course, we want to see football back. We're desperate to see it back in many ways. But I still think there's a deep unease about the idea of football coming back at the moment. But as far as this idea of next season goes, I think in the lower leagues, and certainly in non-league, they are talking openly about the idea of there being no football until the beginning of 2021. But that's slightly different because there's nothing in it for them to play behind closed doors, and financially that would be more ruinous. It'd be more ruinous to play behind closed doors with no gate receipts than it would be not to play. At the moment, they can go into hibernation and stay in hibernation. It's a bit different for the elite leagues, for the Premier League and the Championship, because they have the possibility of television money if they play behind closed doors. Now, the desirability of playing behind closed doors is another thing, but I certainly think that if our numbers start to come down, and I think it has to be contingent on that, if our numbers start to come down, if we feel more comfortable with a return to football, if there is less pressure on our health services, then it becomes more and more possible to think about football coming back. I just don't think we have got there yet.
For you, Darren, you obviously you've said that it has to take its place in society, football. But once, if you like, the health, if it were possible that the health checks were able to be put in place, what do you see as the pitfalls of playing behind closed doors?
Well, the point's already been made, Geoff, that players aren't robots, and the players themselves are articulating the pitfalls. Jonathan Walters has been saying this week on social media, no matter how many tests you do, you can't guarantee the safety of players. And he, in his own tweet, was saying clubs have got a legal responsibility, a legal obligation to ensure that safety for the players. And, we all make this point as journalists sitting around a metaphorical table. Let's not kid ourselves about the fact that this is having on our own industry. There are journalists watching this show who have been furloughed. I've taken a pay cut. I don't mind saying so. Other journalists have taken pay cuts because they've had to be able to help their respective businesses. We aren't just talking from a distance about something that affects footballers. Sky, I'm sure you don't mind me saying, Geoff, Sky have had to make adjustments because this affects us all. And so not having any football isn't something that we can just throw around willy-nilly as if it doesn't impact on our lives as well and the lives of our families. But at the same time, we have to be clear about the fact that we don't want to be complicit in anything that results in one single serious illness, one single death. Fans don't want to see that, and neither do we.
I mean, Matt, it shows the quite extraordinary times that we are living through at the moment. If you look at this morning's newspapers, the topics range from, as we just said, potentially the whole of next season being wiped out, to managers and referees being mic'd up in matches behind closed doors and doing interviews during the game. That, in some ways, that sums up almost the complete unknown of the current landscape, the distance between those two things.
Yeah, it does, and it is a complete unknown. We know what football behind closed doors is like, because I think Darren, Ollie, and myself were all at the Croatia game, and it was quite a unique experience, and it was fascinating. It was hearing Jordan Henderson tearing into the Croatia manager and things like that. It was quite a novel experience. But it really is the unknown. I was talking to a football club owner this week, Geoff, who from one of the lower leagues, and his doctor pulled him to one side and said, "Just the thought, but have we got owners' liability insurance?" And the owner said, "Oh, I'm not sure we have." And the doctor said, "Well, what does happen if either one of our players becomes seriously ill, or heaven forbid dies, or somebody in their family is affected to that extent? Are we covered insurance-wise?" And then in a meeting this week, I believe that actually came up in one of the EFL meetings. It came up where one of the owners said, "Is there, has everybody thought about owners' liability insurance?" And these are things that just people haven't had to. It's a bit like the way that some sports, amazingly, like Wimbledon, one of them. Some sports amazingly had the foresight to have pandemic insurance. But there's so much that is uncharted about the territory that we're all in here, and these are the challenges that keep coming up. And these are the obstacles that keep coming up. You think you've got into a position, and then suddenly the players start to articulate that they don't want to go. And that was one of the things that came up in Friday's meeting. Was one of the club officials said, "I think a big issue now is getting the players back on side."
Well, obviously, it's very gloomy for all football fans right now in terms of their sport. But for Manchester City fans, this morning, the newspaper headlines won't have made pleasant reading. Kevin De Bruyne wondering aloud, potentially, about how long Manchester City would be out of the Champions League and his thoughts on that. Join us after this. This is the Sunday Supplement, as well, of course, discussing football's return. We've been casting an eye over this morning's newspapers, and one eye-catching headline in the Mail on Sunday, written by Joe Bernstein, is Kevin De Bruyne, who appears to be wondering aloud with regard to his future. I've read this, Ollie. I've read this article, as I'm sure you have, and I don't think it's what often we say that the headline is out of context. But he uses the words, doesn't he, that, one season out of the Champions League I could maybe live with, but 2 seasons. What's your reading into the article?
Yeah, it's much the same as yours, Geoff, actually, that I think that he is saying that if Manchester City are facing a 2-year ban from Europe, and if their appeal is unsuccessful, then that's going to have a big impact on his future. And that, I think, as you alluded to, that would be really bad news for City fans, because I think that even after the season that Liverpool have had, where Liverpool have swept all before them, and they've had so many outstanding performers that it's hard to pick one. Even given that, I think there are a lot of people who feel that Kevin De Bruyne has been the best player in the Premier League this season. He is an outstanding player to watch, and I think obviously City have played some beautiful football over the last few years under Guardiola, and I think for much of that time, David Silva has been the person that people would point to as the heartbeat of the side, and possibly their best player, certainly their best creative player. That mantle has been taken over by Kevin De Bruyne now, and he's a lovely player to watch. He's everything. He's got everything. He's got 2 fantastic feet. His range of passing is brilliant. His vision is terrific. He's a wonderful player to watch. And so for him to be dropping hints there about his future will be worrying for Manchester City fans. And to be honest, is worrying for our league, because we wouldn't want to lose a player like him. So it heaps even more pressure. I mean, another thing that he says in the piece is the fact that he's confident that City will be able to overcome this ban. So from every point of view, City fans will be hoping that that's the case.
You're absolutely right, Ollie. Darren, he does say in the piece, he says, look, I really like Manchester City. I really enjoy being here. I've got, my employers tell me that they've done nothing wrong, and I believe them. And he also talks about how much he enjoys playing football in this country. He talks about the competitiveness of the English league. But at the same time, if you're a City fan, you would worry. And also as well, do you think it's not unfair for him to wonder aloud as to what the future might hold for him if, and it's a short career, Manchester City are banned from the elite club football in Europe?
Yeah, it's a good question, Geoff, because he's 28 years of age. He's at the top of his game, 16 assists this season, and he is an ambassador for the Premier League, as Ollie was saying. He's one of the best Premier players in Europe, not just at Manchester City. So I think as far as he is concerned, given the problems that City are facing, and as you rightly say, they have signalled their intent to appeal against it, and they will take this all the way to the wire. He's right to consider his own future, and there will be no shortage of big clubs circling him now that he has said that. And given that he's 28, I mean, look, what's quite interesting is he said that he is not going to predicate whatever he's going to do on what Pep Guardiola's going to do. He's got a year left on his contract, Guardiola. And I can't believe that De Bruyne wouldn't look at what Guardiola does in relation to what he will do. If Guardiola says, no, I'm going to continue building, I'm going to sign a new deal, I'm going to stay at the club, then I don't know. I think he could well convince De Bruyne to stay. But having said that, as a player, De Bruyne, now that he's come out and said that in his own words, as you rightly say, other clubs will look at it as maybe an opportunity for them to present an opportunity for them maybe to spirit him away with a chance of competing at the highest level and continuing to win things.
I thought it was a huge blow for City, Geoff, to read that this morning. It was only a couple of weeks ago that we had this extraordinary meeting between all the captains or senior figures at all the Premier League clubs in that meeting with the Premier League and the PFA, and it was De Bruyne who was the City player in that meeting. So that's a measure of his stature in that dressing room. So for them to pick up that report that had come from Belgium this morning, I'm sure is the last thing they need at the moment. The one thing I do wonder is if this ban will be in place for next season, because one of the effects of this pandemic is the fact that the Court of Arbitration for Sport is closed as well at the moment. So the whole appeal process is being held up by this. So if things go ahead as planned and the new football season resumes at the end of August, you have to wonder if those legal processes have got enough time to get to a point where City have either won or lost their appeal. They're very confident they're going to win. But if the situation is unresolved, at some point there's going to be a Champions League draw. And if that situation is unresolved, they're still going to have to be in it. So that's a curious situation. But at the same time, I would question the timing. We should, as journalists, we should never dissuade footballers or any other prominent figures in sport from talking. I do think the timing's a bit curious when there are far bigger things to worry about than Kevin De Bruyne's future. But he is 28 years old, and 2 seasons out of Europe would be a concern.
just to qualify one thing Darren said, Matt, I think actually in the piece, Kevin De Bruyne addresses the fact that Pep Guardiola could leave the club. He says, "Look, I've played under different managers before, so I don't necessarily think that would be problematic to him." It certainly, when I read it, I didn't read it as well. If Guardiola goes, then that would be the cue for me to go, Darren.
Well, but you see, it's easy to say that now, but as with any player, when a manager does leave a football club, you look to see who's going to come in. You look to see if the way that they play is going to suit you. You look to see if they've got a track record of winning things, or whether the club have placed their faith in somebody that might not fit in with what you feel you should be doing. There are any number of things to consider as far as that's concerned. I hope De Bruyne does stay. He's a fantastic player for the football club, and he's as I said before, he's a fantastic ambassador for the club. And with him, they can continue to win things, even if they are out of Europe. They can continue to do well in the Premier League. Without him, I think it would be a massive blow, and certainly in terms of the impact that could have on other players as well.
Staying with Manchester City for the moment, Ollie, I'm sure that you read with great interest the tributes to Michael Robinson, the former Manchester City striker, of course, Liverpool and Brighton as well, who sadly lost his life at the criminally young age of 61. The tributes to him were generous in this country. In Spain, they were absolutely extraordinary, so heartfelt, so warming, because he held such a place of affection in broadcasting in Spain. And as well as reflecting on his football career, when you think about that out loud, but by his own admission, and you're not talking somebody who was a stellar talent, the very top, the elite, the creme de la creme. He went to Spain and he carved out this second career for himself. And I just think it was extraordinary what he achieved there.
Yeah, the tributes to him, Geoff, were so warm that they made me wish that I had known him. I saw him play very briefly when I was a kid, and he joined Manchester City. But I think amongst all the tributes, there was a lovely one that Sid Lowe wrote in The Guardian, which painted a fantastic picture of him. And I was also very moved by Graham Souness's tribute to him about what a lovely, warm man he was. And I think you're right as well to point out the fact that he went out and carved out this second career in Spain, which really marks him out as somebody special, particularly for a country like ours, which is notorious, I suppose, for the fact that we don't really travel particularly well, that we don't adapt to other countries. I mean, Gary Lineker obviously was somebody who flipped that and thrived in Barcelona and loved the culture. But for Michael Robinson to take that step further and to become an incredibly popular presenter in a totally different culture is a huge tribute not just to his personality, but to his ability and his warmth, I think.
Yeah, you're 100% right, Ollie. Having had the privilege of meeting him on a few occasions, I can attest to that. Wonderful, wonderful guy, and genuinely a really, really sad loss, not just for his family, but also for broadcasting and the wider media too. Right, we've got to take our last break of the day. Afterwards, we'll be talking about Dave Kitson and his bid for the PFA leadership, and also Wayne Rooney's observations regarding talent allied to hard work. Wayne Rooney has started writing a regular column for the Sunday Times, and this morning he addresses the issue of hard work that needs to be allied alongside natural talent. And it's a really good read. And the headline is extremely revealing too, when he basically says Ravel Morrison was miles better than Paul Pogba and Jesse Lingard, but he just didn't work like Gary Neville. And he talks about throughout his own career, although he's widely accepted of being a prodigious talent and hugely naturally gifted Rooney, he emphasises the point. He has worked really hard and made sacrifices to have the career that he's had. Matt, what did you make of the piece? It's in your newspaper.
Yeah, very good piece. I think Rooney, without obviously blatant plugging of my own newspaper group, but no, he's been a very good signing so far, Wayne. His columns have been excellent. Ravel Morrison was probably a footballer who, as a young footballer, excited Alex Ferguson more than any other young player he encountered in all his time at Old Trafford. I remember him being very excited by young Joe Cole, even though Joe Cole wasn't at Old Trafford, but he was always tracking his progress. And obviously, so some of the other youngsters, the class of '92 guys, but I don't think anybody caught his eye more than Ravel Morrison. Sadly, Ravel Morrison just, certain problems, certain issues, difficult background, just wasn't able to combine the talent with the commitment, and has really been lost to the English game, and lost to the, if things had gone the right way, he would have been a 100-cap England footballer. But they didn't, and it's a great shame. And Wayne has used him as an example of what's required. I'm not sure many footballers worked as hard as Gary Neville, but no, he's a very good example of a lost talent.
Ollie, do you think it also lays to rest, if you like, a bit of a misconception about Rooney, in that he's the street kid, the entirely natural player, and he just went out and did it? And I think that's something perhaps he's been labelled with throughout his career. And he's making the point here, listen, I didn't just get what I got by just turning up. I worked hard. You have to work hard.
Yeah, I mean, I never believed that about Rooney, to be honest, Geoff. I'm not just trying to be wise after the event, but I think if you watch Manchester United regularly when Wayne Rooney was playing there, you could see how hard he worked. I mean, sure, he's got a lot of goal-scoring records for club and country, but he worked incredibly hard. And I think one of the greatest tributes to Wayne Rooney is that you could always see that he was a team player. I mean, when Ronaldo played for United, I mean, clearly Ronaldo was an outstanding talent, but Rooney did a lot of his work for him. And Rooney was always has been a selfless, unselfish player, essentially. So, I think that shines through in this piece. And you always hear that the best players are often the hardest workers too.
Now, of course, during this crisis for football, the PFA has come under heavy scrutiny. And in fact, there was a challenge for the leadership of the PFA this week from Dave Kitson, the former Reading striker. Darren, what did you make of both the challenge itself, his manifesto, and how it was received?
Well, the manifesto detailed. He was very strong in his condemnation of the PFA. He didn't really say too much within that manifesto that hasn't already been said quite openly. I know Matt's been very strong in it. A number of papers have been very strong on the issues with the PFA, and they are looking at themselves. That said, Geoff, I have to say, I look at what Dave Kitson said, and I still, until today, the timing of which people can make their own minds up about, haven't really had an acceptable response from Dave in relation to the comments that he made in a radio interview after Raheem Sterling was racially abused. He appeared at the time to be suggesting that Sterling was bringing the racial abuse on himself. And I mention that because the response to his candidacy this week has been quite strong. There's been a really vicious backlash. He's trended on social media for a couple of days. Some high-profile players have made it very clear, ex-players have made it very clear that he wouldn't be getting their support. And I would have liked to have seen him come out and address the strong reaction to those comments at the time. Doing it now that he wants to run the organisation, of which a huge contingent are black players, former and current, it doesn't resonate with a lot of people. And I'm sure those people will be coming out to make their views very, very clear.
Geoff, I thought it was. I got wind that there was something going on with Kitson and the PFA earlier in the week, and I did call him, but I hadn't quite realised what he was actually planning to do. And the whole thing's a bit bizarre. The whole thing's a bit ill-conceived. Is, for all the points he just made, I think he's doomed to fail anyway. But it's the fact that he seemed. I don't know, who thought this through for him, or how much he thought about it himself. But you don't launch a campaign or a manifesto to become the chief executive of an organisation. Even after Gordon Taylor has gone on his ludicrous £2.3 million salary, that's still going to be a £500,000 a year job. So the message to Kitson should be: if you want that job, send us your CV, and then you might get an interview and you might get the job. The idea that you launch some kind of campaign to get that job, I thought was utterly bizarre. And I also have to say, this whole thing with the PFA and all the problems with Taylor's leadership really kicked off about 18 months ago, when Ben Purkis, this sort of very low-level footballer who was chairman of the PFA and remains chairman of the PFA, never earned more than £60,000 a year. But he rather courageously chose to take on Taylor, one of the most powerful men in sport. And my question to Dave Kitson now would be: where were you? Where were you when Ben Purkis was actually leading the charge here? Very bravely, I thought. Where were you then? Where were you when all these issues, and one of the questions that he detailed in the Daily Mail about, when were you last elected? When were you last elected to your position? And the fact is, there hasn't been an election since Taylor got into power, 39, 40 years or whatever it is. But where was Dave Kitson then? Where was he when this young guy that had become the chairman of the PFA had actually decided to go to war with Gordon Taylor? Where was he then? Why is it only now that he suddenly wants to take issue with the PFA?
Ollie, last word with you. I mean, Gordon Taylor has his critics, but right now, regardless if it's Dave Kitson or anybody, would it actually be the worst possible time to change the leader of the PFA, given that he is in talks with the EFL? He's talking to Rick Parry, he's talking to his players. Is now the worst time?
Well, I think that Dave Kitson's candidacy was probably doomed from the moment that he didn't address the comments that he'd made about Raheem Sterling, because I think that he will find it very hard to gather any sort of constituency amongst the BAME players in the PFA. But yes, it doesn't feel like the right time, Geoff. There are lots of issues with the players at the moment, and I think they need to be united at the moment. The candidacy is for later.
Unfortunately, Ollie, I have to interrupt you there because we are out of time. Thoroughly enjoyed all of your company. Thank you for joining us from home, Matt and Ollie. Darren, thank you for joining us from your luxurious studio at the bottom of your garden. Thanks for your time, guys. Thank you for your company as well. We'll be back next week. The Sunday Supplement will be back with you once again at 10 a.m. reporting on all of the big stories of the week and where football's going next. Thanks for your company. Goodbye for now.